Fire. You feel a flame's heat, but not the burn. Time loses meaning. Moments stretch like the final seconds of a fever dream. You feel motion, but not your own. The breath in your lungs feels alien, as though exhaled down your throat by something unseen. You force your eyes open, and you see green, all-encompassing, all-consuming. The jungle suffocates you like a voracious, sentient maw. Vines twisting like veins, leaves that glare instead of shade. This is not the green of Central Park. This is the green of ancient struggle. The green of things that grow to conquer. You feel something skitter down your back beneath your shirt, and you realize you're sweating. The very air here feels hostile, thick with the scent of rot, and something older, something abominable. You feel your chest tighten. The press of it, the presence is overwhelming. You try and call out for someone else, but your voice is trapped in your throat. Panic surges as you reach for your mouth, and you feel stitches across your lips. Coarse, rough, and pulled tight. Your lips are sealed, and even when you claw at them, the fibers hold fast. Your silence is absolute. Then from behind you, you hear a rustling. From the tangle of verdant limbs, you see something emerge from the underbrush. A face, if what you see deserves that name. Hewn from pale limewood or quila, grown strange in the deep, dark green. Its carved grin is unnatural, jagged, gleeful, not with mirth, but malice. It stretches wide, too wide, past anatomy, past reason. Its surface bears gouges as though gnawed by beasts or marked in some forgotten rite. Eyes, if they are eyes, glitter within deeply hewn sockets, lightless yet aware. And then you realize it sees you as a god sees an offering, and it is ravenous. You lurch to your feet, throat raw with the scream you cannot release, and you run. Run through the green labyrinth that pulses with inescapable life. Behind you, you hear no footfalls, no sound, and yet you know that it follows. It always follows. With a gasp, you wake up and feel your body drenched in sweat. You scramble to find your glasses before looking around frantically for the face among the boughs. But you're not in a forest. You're in your room, in your parents' house on Fifth Avenue. You hear cars driving past the window and the sound of New York life mere feet away. But just in case, you look around at your bookshelves full of anthropology texts, at your dresser with your Harvard degree lying carelessly on top, and over at your desk with your field journals and notes strewn across it. Slowly, your breathing slows down, and your logical mind takes over. You look over at a low table by your window, and you see several carved wooden figures from your last trip to Dutch New Guinea. Their elongated limbs cast jagged shadows across the floorboards. A small shield leans in a corner, half wrapped in canvas. A mask leans against the window frame, its features carved in a terrifying rictus. And with a breathless chuckle, you tell yourself that's what you must have seen in your dream. There's no creature in the jungle. It was just your mind. making sense of the images around you. You look over at the door of your room at the calendar pinned against the back. A date is circled in bright red marker. October 18, 1961. The words Dutch New Guinea are written next to it. Hello everyone, and welcome to the world-famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. My name is Andrew Medina. I am member number 1212, and I'm so glad to be your host. Welcome to the very first Campfire Stories with Andy. In this series, we examine mysterious, unexplained, and unsolved mysteries from off the beaten path. Today, for our very first campfire story, we're going to talk about the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller. I want to start our story with a question. How does the son of one of America's foremost families disappear without a trace? Was he lost, or did he not want to be found? Michael Clark Rockefeller was born in 1938. He was the son of Nelson, who would become U.S. Vice President under Gerald Ford, and Mary, a well-known philanthropist. His great-grandfather was none other than John D. Rockefeller Sr., the founder of Standard Oil and one of the great titans of American industry. To say Michael grew up privileged would be underselling it a little bit. His family didn't invent the phrase summer in the Hamptons, but they certainly helped popularize it. For us Angelinos who may not know, summering in the Hamptons is when New York's rich and powerful pack up their homes and pack up their city homes and families and move out to the tip of Long Island for a summer of swimming, camping, and networking. It's still where New York's most powerful movers and shakers go to escape the Big Apple when things get a little too hot. Picture, if you would, little Michael Rockefeller playing tennis at the Meadow Club of Southampton and chasing his brothers and sisters around one of the many pools that dot the Hamptons. Children like Michael didn't go to the beach where just anyone could lay down a towel. No. Rockefeller children played in one of the many club pools that dotted the Hamptons. Another question for the group. If you were a wealthy New York socialite and you wanted your child to have an understanding of geopolitics such that when they came of age, they would be able to step into a role that you would prepare for them on the world stage, what countries would you want them to experience? Well, when Michael was born, Nelson was busy developing his political and cultural ties to Latin America, which he correctly believed would be a major source of geopolitical influence and trade in the latter half of the 20th century. President Franklin Roosevelt appointed him coordinator of inter-American affairs in 1940, and Nelson brought his family with him to Mexico City, where he worked to strengthen cultural diplomacy. Michael accompanied his family during these stays, visiting historical sites like Teotihuacan and absorbing indigenous art and culture. Nelson's other work with the Inter-American Affairs Office took the family to Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and Peru. These trips, while diplomatic in nature, involved visits to Amazonian regions, meetings with government officials, and cultural site visits. And so even at a young age, Michael witnessed firsthand the fusion of tribal, colonial, and modern life in these countries. Of course, there is a standard European fare as well for a family such as Michael's. France, Italy, Britain, Spain were all regular destinations in Michael's life. Since the Rockefellers were known as patrons of the European arts and architecture, Michael was immersed in both classical and modern art and learned to recognize the visual markers that define different artistic eras. The Louvre, Uffizi, the British Museum, the Tate Galleries, or Mott, all breathed into Michael an appreciation of art and a fascination with history. Now, I've talked a little bit about Michael's father, Nelson, but I also want to talk about Mary, Michael's mother. She was the daughter of another American royal family, the Clarks. The Clarks were best known for their influence in the Philadelphia banking sector at the turn of the century. She went to Bryn Mawr, where she developed a lifelong appreciation for history, aesthetics, and civic engagement. Now, when she married Nelson, Mary could have just been a trophy wife, but that wasn't really her style. She was never just an ornament on Nelson's arm. She used her name and connections to foster cultural literacy and social responsibility, particularly among women. She was a devoted supporter of the Young Women's Christian Association and championed advancements of women's education and leadership, serving on boards and raising funds for programs that promoted equity and empowerment. Mary was also deeply involved in the world of art. She supported the Museum of Modern Art and helped solidify MoMA's legacy as a cultural institution that brought contemporary art to a broader public. So now that we've answered the question I asked a few minutes ago, what do you think Michael did? Did he follow his father and Uncle Winthrop into politics? Did he follow his mother, grandfather, and Uncle John and Sister Anne into philanthropy? Or did he follow his uncles Lawrence, David, and brother Rodman into business and become a titan of industry like his great-grandfather? If he went to Harvard, any of those would have been an easy step for him. Who thinks he went into politics? Raise your hand. Who thinks he went into philanthropy? Who thinks he did business? I see folks shaking their head because I think you know. Those things weren't really Michael. Michael wanted something different. All the art and history and cultural literacy he saw with his parents had sown a seed in Michael's brain that would blossom into a passionate love of tribal art. It didn't hurt as well that Nelson opened up the Museum of Primitive Art in New York when Michael was 19. It was in this museum that Michael was able to study Aztec and Mayan art right in his backyard, developing a special connection with face masks. It's also here that Michael began to discuss his interests with anthropologists. Soon, he started accompanying them on expeditions into the field to study and collect such art. One of these expeditions he chose was to a country known at the time as Dutch New Guinea. Today, it's known as Papua. Now, who here has been to Papua New Guinea? Raise your hand. I know some people have. This is the Adventurers Club. Okay, great. In a couple words, how would you describe it? Just yell it out. Tribes. Love it. Dangerous. Love it. What else? Green. Love it. Anything else? Isolated. Ooh, good word. Can I make another suggestion? Honest. And I'm not talking about the culture or human developments on the island. I'm talking about the land itself. Anyone who's been to the island knows it's a hard country. It is not for the meek or forgetful. It's a furnace wrapped in vines and rot, where light falls like a curse through the canopy and umber rivers snake their way through the underbrush. Mountains rise in jagged sheaves like the backs of one of the many thousands of crocodiles that swim through the island's veins. Days swim with heat. Nights howl. The jungle there is a living thing. Life hangs from every limb with teeth and spores. Things which are known and things without name. And long before Michael arrived, men lived there, in clearings cut by stone, in villages wrapped in smoke and bark cloth. They ripped their survival from the earth itself and found ways to live in this harsh, green land. Their gods were carved from wood and stone and wood and bone and spoke in fire. They moved through the forest like spirits, faces painted with ash and ochre, carrying spears and axes. Their speech was many-tongued. Their histories were told in song and with hands. It's a hard land, an old land, but it does not lie. It wears its harshness on its sleeve like a badge of honor. And maybe it was this honesty that drew Michael to it for the first time in 1960. he hoped to encounter a newly discovered group known as the Asmat people, a community whose artistic traditions had remained largely unseen by the rest of the world. His intention was not only to meet them, but also to bring their art back to the United States. At the time, the Asmat had only recently come into contact with outsiders. Sailors, missionaries, anthropologists, things of that nature. Their worldview was strikingly different than the Westerners who approached them. They believed that life itself was rooted in the land, in the island, and that anything arriving from beyond the sea, be it boat or object or human person, was not of this world, but a spirit in physical form. So when the Dutch and British sailors first made contact with the coastal villages of what was then Dutch New Guinea, the Asmat people often perceived them as spirits, possibly ancestors or otherworldly beings. That belief began to fade as encounters became more frequent, but it illustrates how distant and insular their culture had been. Their system of justice, too, operated on very different notions than Western ones. It was rooted in spiritual balance and reciprocity. The Asmat were not a single unified group. It was more a collection of network of interrelated tribes. If one tribe attacked and killed killed two men in another, it was expected that the offended tribe could kill two men in return. Such killings weren't mere vengeance. They were believed to restore a cosmic equilibrium. Acts like murder disrupted the spiritual fabric of life, and only through rebalancing, through ritual and blood, could harmony be restored. Remember this, comrades. It's going to matter soon. When Michael Rockefeller first arrived on the shores of Dutch New Guinea, he made his way to Osenet village, one of the many nestled along the vast, unmapped swamps and rivers of the Asmat region. After days of slow, sweating travel along the river's edge, Michael arrived at the village. The men approached first, silent and watchful, beneath towering masks and spears carved with ghosts. Through a translator, they made their boundary clear. He could take photographs, but the carvings, spirit would remain. The art was not his to carry. With his expedition team behind him, Michael smiled, nodded, and raised his camera. The villagers allowed it. Faces appeared in the lens, proud, painted, and still. Moments held in time forever. From what survives, field notes, letters, pages from his journal, Michael was understanding. He respected the Asmat people's culture and realized that trust was an important building block to a long-term relationship. In his diary entries, he wrote with a kind of reverence, even gratitude. He called the place absorbing. He called the people complex and beautiful. He said he felt more at home there in the steaming jungle than in any room of glass or stone in New York. He was respectful. He was patient. And for a while, things went quietly, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. When Michael returned to New York in early 1961, there was only one thing on his mind: getting back to Dutch New Guinea. He felt he had more to do there and didn't want to waste any time. He reached out to a Dutch anthropologist named René Vassing, and the two made plans to return to the island later that year. He set off from New York on October 18, 1961. Now, to reach the village of Osenet, the only way in is by boat. The jungle is too thick, the land too soaked and snarled with mangrove to cut through, especially with all of the gear and equipment that Michael and Renee were carrying. The sea, for all its fury, is the only road in. And that is how Michael and Renee came to be skimming the hillside in a small catamaran, riding low in the water near the mouth of the glacier in the heart of Asmat territory. the winds. The sea, which could shift winds quicker than a tyrant's fury, choppy waves rose like fists. The catamaran, more raft than ship, buckled under the assault. It flipped, throwing Michael and Renee and their two native guides into the sea. The shore was a distant smear across the horizon, 10 miles away. And the boat had no wind, no flames. So they clung to the hull, like a child clutching its mother, until the seas were bored of being and the clouds parted. But then there was another problem: the sun. The sun began its assault, beating down hour after hour, tides buffeted all the ground this morning. Initially, they hoped that the tide to pull closer to shore, where it would be more likely that someone would see them, or give them a better chance to swim for it. But after 12 hours, many games have long since been repeated by the tides. Hours pass, another day. There's an axiom in survival stories that states you can survive 3 weeks without food as long as you have water. You can survive 3 days without water as long as you have shelter. You can survive 3 hours without shelter in a harsh environment as long as you have air. While that's true, that time is not equivalent. It may be true you can survive but how close does one get to that and still be able to flourish? It may be true you can survive well, but does that factor in sitting on the top of the mountain while the sun beats down on you and the shore is 12 miles away? If you believe that you're capable of swimming to shore at your best, how long do you think you'd be able to when the sun is southeast? How long would you sit on your boat, waiting for rescue that will never come? All the while knowing that your clock is ticking, you waited too long. At some point, at least a day, but no one can say the exact hour, and Michael went toward shore and made the decision. The group had managed to salvage 2 jerry cans and some water. He tied the 2 empty gasoline canisters to his waist to serve as proof flotation devices. He was going to swim for 12 miles in open water. The last recorded words of Michael Rockefeller before he dove into the waves was the Dutch New Guinea. Think you can make it. He swam into the horizon. 12 hours later, a search boat arrived and, spotting the overturned catamaran, sailed up and rescued the remaining survivors. When Renee saw the boat, his heart leapt for joy. Michael had done it. He had reached the shore and found some local authorities and told them about their plight, and they had dispatched a boat to rescue them. When he boarded the boat, half expecting to see his friend standing there waiting for him, smiling. But when he spoke to the Dutch New Guinea, when they saw the catamaran, they hadn't been sent to rescue them. Renee's heart sank as he realized. Michael hadn't reached the authorities. He was still out there. He told the crew of the search boat about their missing companion. But when they reached the shore to look for Michael, they found only swamp and sand. No sign of struggle, no footprints, no body. Just the jungle. Imagine it, comrades. A Rockefeller, gone. Just like that. Swallowed by the jungle or sea or something else entirely. When word reached the outside world that Michael Rockefeller had vanished off the coast of Dutch New Guinea, the reaction was swift and thunderous. Not a soul could believe it. A Rockefeller didn't just disappear. A disappearing Rockefeller was the stuff international incidents were made of. So the Dutch government threw everything they had at the island. Helicopters, planes, patrol boats, military trucks. Dutch colonial soldiers trudging through the jungle, and for 2 long weeks, the cries of dasyurids and bats was drowned out by another, altogether more human sound. The name Michael, shouted again and again into the impenetrable green. But let's not pretend it was organized. The truth is, they were running blind. The jungle wasn't mapped. Half the rivers didn't even have names. So picture it. Young soldiers wading through the steaming swamps with rifles and radios that barely worked, screaming a foreign man's name to the vines and trees. A needle in a haystack is putting it charitably. And the Rockefellers, of course, weren't going to leave it to chance. Or if they must, they could always put their green thumb on the scale. They offered $250,000 for information leading to Michael's return. Back then, that kind of money could buy you land, it could buy you power, it could even buy you silence. Today, it'd be worth about $2.7 million. And while that might be a powerful incentive to the Dutch living on the island, it wasn't exactly an incentive for the native tribes, many of whom still relied on barter and trade to remain supplied. Still, nothing turned up. Just wet footprints, rumors, and whispers. Between the unforgiving jungle and 12 miles of predator-filled ocean, the odds of finding a body were never good. 9 days in, and the Dutch officials began to lose hope. The colonial minister finally admitted it aloud. They weren't going to find him. And by the end of the second week, 14 days after he went missing, the search for Michael was officially called off. Michael was declared dead. The official cause of death was drowning. And that's the end of our story. Thank you all so much for coming. Drive home safe, and we'll see you next time off the beaten... No, I'm just kidding. That's not where the story ends. You know that's not where the story ends. We are just getting started. The Rockefellers also didn't buy the official line. Not really. They kept that reward in place even after the Dutch authorities had concluded the investigation. And neither did people who'd been watching the story unfold from the edges. People like Carl Hoffman, a journalist who retraced Michael's path over 50 years later. Hoffman has a very good book called Savage Harvest, not to be confused with the movie of the same name, that uncovers the secrets of the jungle that the jungle and the Dutch kept buried. Missionary journals, eyewitness stories, a hired private investigator, even classified Dutch files locked away from the public, and even the Rockefellers themselves. Why hide the files? Why silence the witnesses? What really happened to Michael after he disappeared over the horizon? Before we can answer that question, we have to understand the tension between the Dutch colonial powers, the native tribes, and the broader world as it related to New Guinea. So, if you'll bear with me for a second, I'd like to take a quick but important detour to talk about pain. See, here's the thing about pain. It lingers. It settles into the soul, not always loudly, but with a dull persistence that often outlives its cause. And pain doesn't stay where it started. It travels. It passes between people and down through generations like heirlooms. We roll our eyes at the phrase, hurt people, but look past the cliche and really think about that idea for a moment. Have you ever been in pain, such that it led to you hurting someone else? Now think of that pain and spread it across a group, or a tribe, A wound suffered by one generation can warp the hearts of the next, shaping their fears, their anger, their resentment. And sometimes people born into that inheritance of hurt become hard without knowing why. They carry the scars of someone else's suffering, mistaking it for their own, and in trying to protect themselves from invisible threats, they hurt others. That is the legacy of unresolved pain. It teaches people to survive by doing harm, even when those they harm were never part of the original violence. 3 years before Michael's fateful expedition, a war had broken out between the tribes along the southern coast. Death and blood feuds spilled into the jungle, and to the Dutch, clinging to control of their shrinking colony, it was a nuisance they could not afford. So they sent soldiers. Colonial forces, armed with rifles, stomped into the jungle to settle it. And if threats didn't work, there was always fire and blood. The natives saw white men march into their villages with guns and no words they could understand. They raised their spears in defense. The white men opened fire. Villagers fell. And when the Dutch left the jungle, they left the tribes to count their dead and bury the balance. Now, by the time Michael Rockefeller vanished in 1961, the island he disappeared on wasn't just a tangle of rivers and rainforests. It was a powder keg packed to bursting with unresolved pain. The Dutch controlled it. The Indonesians wanted it. The tribes were caught in the middle. And the rest of the world? They were watching, but none too closely. See, back then, the United Nations was much more heavy-handed with bringing countries into compliance and control. So, in places like New Guinea, where ancient traditions and modern sensibilities crashed like the tectonic plates that underlay the land itself, they let the civilized powers sort things out. So the Dutch, nervous and increasingly desperate, clung to their hold of the island as Indonesian forces pressed in on them from the west. And then, right in the middle of that mounting chaos, the son of one of the richest men in the world vanishes into the jungle near a tribe whose name was whispered alongside the word cannibal. The Dutch didn't see a missing person. They saw a disaster. There were those who believe, and not without reason, that the Dutch authorities were told very plainly, if you find out what happened to Michael Rockefeller, bury it along with him. Because the truth was dangerous. The truth might shatter whatever little control they still held. If it was found that Michael Rockefeller was captured and killed by cannibals, then the truth might cause the UN to reconsider whether Dutch New Guinea might not be better off as Indonesian New Guinea. So 9 days in, the Dutch minister declared the search hopeless. He's gone, they said, drowned, end of story, nothing to see here. Go home, please. For better or for worse, cannibalism was still alive and well in the swamps and river villages of New Guinea, and specifically in the Asmat region. The Dutch knew it. The missionaries knew it. Even Michael knew it. But they told the world that it was over, that it had been outlawed, that the natives were reformed. A lie, but a useful one. And while the world politely looked the other way, the Rockefeller family kept digging. They hired their own investigator to find out what happened. That man traveled deep into the jungle, and when he emerged, what he brought back was strange. He brought back 3 human skulls. He had traded a boat engine for them, and the villagers who handed them over said they belonged to 3 white men. One of them they said, was named Michael. The one from the search. The American. The Rockefeller. When he returned to the States, the investigator handed the skulls off to the family. To the Rockefeller's family. There is no official record of that exchange, of course, but there is a record of a payment. $250,000 wired directly to him not long after. Follow the money, and you follow the truth, at least the shape of it. Whatever else those skulls were, Michael's family must have believed. There's no formal report on what happened, no press conference, no admission, but there is a story. The investigator had gone deep into the jungle, into the Asmat territory, questioning elders and listening for fractures in the silence. At one point, he approached an old man, hunched and blinking, behind a dusty pair of eyeglasses. The investigator asked if the man knew Michael Rockefeller. The man shook his head. No. But then the investigator looked closer. "Are you wearing glasses?" he asked. "Yes." "Where'd you get them?" "I don't know. I found them." And when the investigator looked at pictures of Michael, he saw very similar glasses. Years later, the journalist Carl Hoffman picked up the trail. He'd studied Michael's disappearance for years and finally decided to go to the island himself. When his boat reached the village of Osenep, when they pulled up to the same shoreline that Michael had disappeared, where Michael had last been seen, his interpreter tapped him on the shoulder and pointed over to a group of men talking quietly amongst themselves, a few yards away. And that interpreter said, "Those villagers over there just said, 'Don't tell the white man about the one we killed.'" And that's how it started. Carl and his interpreter followed the voices. They approached the villagers and Carl asked, "What do you mean?" One of the men looked him straight in the eyes and said flatly, "We killed Michael Rockefeller." That's how casually it was said, like the weather, like something everyone already knew. And it turns out they did. It was no secret. Everyone knew it had happened. It had been passed down from elder to child for 50 years. Remember I told you the story about the wars between the Dutch settlers and the native tribes? How only blood could pay for blood? That killing was the only way to reset the cosmic order? Well, when a white man, this one unarmed and unknown, staggered onto that stretch of beach, perhaps they didn't see a lost traveler. Perhaps they saw balance. 2 Dutch missionaries who lived on the island nearly a decade later would confirm the story. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, just enough to reveal the outline of something dreadful. On the morning of November 19th, 1961, a group of warriors stood waiting on the shore just past the tree line. Michael Rockefeller swam to land. He pulled himself onto the shore, and then he vanished. The warriors were walking along the riverbank, looking for food. Fish, roots, whatever the jungle might offer that day. The air was thick, the kind that presses on your lungs, and the water lapped quietly at the shore. That's when they saw it, something dragging itself out of the surf. At first they thought it was a crocodile. That would be the logical thing. But as they got closer, squinting through the haze, they realized it was a man. Soaked, gasping, and barely alive. Michael Rockefeller had made it. 12 miles, through shark-infested, storm-tossed sea, alone. And yet there he was, crawling up onto the land like some half-drowned spirit. It almost makes you want to cheer for him. Almost. I ask for your indulgence here, comrades, even though I've read this story many times and I know how it ends. It's still very difficult to recount. At first, the tribesmen didn't move. There were old beliefs in these parts and fears that ran deep. Some of the elders still whispered that white men were not just men, they were spirits. And now, here was one, pale and trembling, rising from the sea. But then they started speaking, low and fast, and that fear began to change. The questions turned to memory, and memory turned to anger. They remembered how 3 years earlier, Dutch soldiers had come to the island with guns and words they couldn't understand. They didn't speak the language. They didn't care to learn. And when the villagers defended themselves, when they so much as raised a spear in defense of their land, the soldiers opened fire. Blood soaked the soil. Fathers fell, and sons watched. And now some of those sons stood there on that riverbank, looking down at Michael Rockefeller. And they decided they would take him. Spears struck. The jungle swallowed any screams. Michael was dragged back to the village, not as a prisoner, but as an offering, as justice. What happened next, you may want to cover your ears, but I'll tell you all the same. According to the traditional practices of the tribe, they opened his skull and ate his brain. They stripped the flesh from his bones, roasted it, and consumed it. His bones were carved into tools, dagger handles, spearheads. His blood was drained and used in ritual dance. And after this explosion of activity, quiet returned to the Asmat people. For a time. And then the world came looking. Planes, helicopters, giant machines that kicked up the earth. The villagers had never seen anything like it. To them, this was vengeance. It was the spirits returning in force for one of their own, and for a few weeks their quiet life was shattered. But eventually the helicopters left. The noise faded. But then came something quieter and much smaller. Cholera. A sickness that swept through the island and hollowed out huts. Some say it was brought by the Dutch, but the villagers, they knew better. They knew what it really was. It was a curse. The white spirit they had killed had sent his brothers back to exact terrible vengeance. That was the price of their transgression. In Carl Hoffman's journey decades later, everyone he spoke to in the area knew the story. They spoke of it like folklore, passed down through generations. But no one ever said they did it, or he did it, or she did it. And if you believed that the spirits were watching, searching for those who defiled one of their own, would you say it? Would you say you did it? Just before Hoffman left, he witnessed something. A man surrounded by children performing a story. Animated, full of motion, miming spears and death. Hoffman scrambled for his camera. He only caught the last few words. Don't tell the white spirits about the white spirit we killed. They'll come back. They'll bring death. They'll kill us all. But none of that can ever be officially written down. It will forever remain a campfire story you tell to scare your friends. Now, comrades, based on everything we've talked about, the bones, the whispers, the missionaries, it sure seems like we know what happened to Michael Rockefeller. But just when you think the story's over, something strange slips in the side door. In 2008, a filmmaker named Fraser Heston, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because he was the son of Charlton Heston, was digging through the bones of the case himself. He was working on a documentary about Michael's disappearance, and like any good director, he needed B-roll. Shots of the island, the people, the jungle, things of that nature. So he starts tracking down old archival footage. And in a warehouse in England, what does Heston come across amidst those reels and reels of unused film but a frame? a flicker. A man. Not just any man. A white man. Pale, shirtless, standing barefoot among the tribe, covered in paint, holding a spear like he's born to it. He's doing more than just observing. He's participating. He's in the ritual, moving with them, painted like them. And that was 8 years after Michael vanished. People started calling the man in the frame Big Michael, the ghostly figure who appears for just a second in a grainy shot from 1969 and then vanishing back into legend. There's no proof it's him, no hard evidence, but stare at the frame for long enough and maybe you'll see Michael staring back. So then comes the theory. Maybe Michael wasn't killed. Maybe he was accepted. Maybe, after swimming through the storm, collapsing on the shore, and looking death in the eye, they spared him. Maybe he found something there, something that made more sense than the polished world he came from. Maybe he didn't want to be found. He had studied the Esmat, admired them, even once said in his journals that their world felt more true than his own. So maybe the great irony of it all is he did become part of the tribe one way or the other. Whether they took him in and painted his skin or took him apart and boiled his bones, either way, Michael Rockefeller became a part of that island, body and spirit, in flesh and in memory. Michael Rockefeller went missing in November 1961. He was 23 years old. Despite having such a short life, Michael's legacy lives on. The art he collected was displayed in the Museum of Primitive Art and later in the Michael C. Rockefeller wing of the Museum of Modern Art. These are some of those pieces. And that is the story of Michael Rockefeller. I really hope you enjoyed, and I really appreciate everyone who came out to watch. For the folks online, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps us out a ton. And if you're in LA, why not come on by? We meet every Thursday, and you can hear even more stories of adventure from our amazing speakers, ask your questions from our live audience, and meet them in person. That's going to do it for us here at the Adventurers Club. Thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you next time beside the campfire off the beaten path.